Welcome to the last part of our three-part web coding series. Yeah, let's just jump in. So as a reminder, we started with HTML, then went to some CSS, and then now today we're going to go through some more intermediate and advanced CSS topics. Let's go. So primarily what we're going to be focusing on today is going to be, if this loads faster, is this concept of responsive web design. So how do we code a site to make it appear good on multiple different screens? So whether this is a wider laptop screen or a tablet or a phone, just basically how do we do this, this design? If we have time, there's some other cool things that I'll show you how to do as well. If you want to follow along with the starting files, you just go to that link that I've placed up there. So bit.ly/F24 web coding W3 right here. And this should take you to this Google Drive file. And then you just need to download and make sure that we have this here. And then if I go to where it is in my Finder, if I double click on it, it should open up this folder. And in this folder is going to be our starting file. So I already have our starting HTML code, our starting CSS code, and then our starting assets all contained in this folder. And so to get started, you just take that folder and you drag it to our Visual Studio Code editor. If you need to download that, you just go to code.visualstudio.com and download, and back in Visual Studio Code, which is going to be our code editor. You can see that for the HTML file, I put comments in here that explain what is all happening. And same with that CSS. All of the stuff that's contained in these are the things that we did go over in the past 2 weeks. So I'll let you all get started in setting that up as we go back here. So again, responsive web design is just how do we design a website that looks good on multiple different screens? And there's 3 primary ways that we're going to explore on how to do this. One called Flexbox, one called Grid, and one called Media Queries. So Flexbox is essentially just a way that you can style some content that puts it into a box and then flexes it or moves it to certain areas in that box. And then that box just resizes with the screen when it's on a different screen. There's Grid also. And in Grid, you are defining some columns and some rows to create our typical kind of grid or table kind of layout structure. And here you put those items into the specific location. So you could put it into here, you could have it span 2, all of that stuff. In general, this is a very rudimentary way to think about these two. Flexbox is really good for one-dimensional stuff, so left to right or top to bottom. And then Grid is really good for two-dimensional when you're going to have multiple columns and multiple rows. And then media queries are essentially a way that you can tell the code to look at a user's screen and then change the code based on that. So how we're going to be doing that is based on width, because a laptop width is going to be much bigger than like a tablet, which would maybe be like here, and then a phone, which would be much smaller. Cool. Awesome. So let's jump into our Visual Studio Code, and we're going to run our live server extension. So if you need that, you just click over here on the extensions pane and you just search live server, and it's this purple one by Ritwick Day. And once you install that, you should see this go live button down here. And again, this is just essentially how we can click this. It opens up in a browser tab, and then we can see all the changes that we're making here. And so this is what we're starting with. Again, it's not looking the greatest, but we're going to make it look a lot better with what we're doing today. Additionally, if you ever want to test this responsive web design, you can just click and drag your browser window to simulate different screen sizes, so you can see how your content is moving in those different ways. Okay, so going back to Visual Studio Code, I'm going to control click, or you can right click on that styles.css file in your Explorer, and I am going to put open to the side. And that just basically allows us to have our HTML code in one panel and our CSS code in another panel so that we can see it all at the same time. And then I'm going to click over here to close that Explorer. All right, cool. So the first part of this kind of responsive web design / layout that we're going to be going through is a concept called float. So with our elements here, if you control click on Chrome and click inspect, remember that's how you open up this Chrome developer tools right here. So if I were to click my element selector and I like hover over these areas, right? I can see that it's all the way across the width of the screen for some. And that's just due to the fact that this is a block type element. So for example, here an image is not, so it's only showing me this image, where if I scroll over, the list item is. So it's going to take up the full width of my screen, even if it doesn't have content to fill that full thing. So the float property is best used when you want to put images and text side by side. It's really the only thing you're going to ever use it for. So let's put that into practice. So we have our About Me section and our text below. Let's add our image in our HTML so that it's in that same section. So if I go over to my HTML and I go under my going down, we have this div that says ID equals about section. And we have these paragraphs right here. So let's just go through, write some HTML to add an image. So we're going to put img, and remember we use our source, our src equals period / and then you can just pick something in that images folder. So I'm going to pick this project 1 image, but you can pick whatever you want. Okay. So now if I close that off and I save it and I go back here, I can see that my project 1 image is here, even though it's really blown up. It's really big. So let's just quickly change that. So I'm just going to change the height and set that equal to 300 pixels. And then my width is going to be equal to 600 pixels, just so that we can all see it on the same screen. So now it is like this. So by default, our paragraph elements are going to be block level elements. So even though there is enough room right here, probably to move this image and place it here, move the text, it's not going to do that because by default, this paragraph is going to take up the whole entire width, even if it's not long enough to do so. But I am going to go back here and I'm going to add an ID just to be our about image so that we can target it with our CSS. So I'm going to go up, I'm just going to go to the top of my CSS file now. To target this image, remember we can use that ID selector. So that's our pound symbol. And then we type in that name that we put in here at ID. So about image space, and then we do our curly brackets. And so we've set up our rule here. So what we're going to do here is just to float it to one side or the other of our text. So I'm going to put float left. So float :space and then type in left. And now when I save that and I go back here, nothing's really going to change. But if we, let's see if we float right. And no, because I've set it up wrong. 1 second. Let me just make sure I'm doing this correctly. There we go. So I put in this text and this image into our div, like we were practicing before with HTML. And then in my about image, I floated it to the right. So this is just saying like, hey, go as far right as possible in the space that you have. I can also float left. When you do this on the image and there's some text by it, what it's going to do is create this side-by-side effect. Now, there's some other CSS that I have applied here that's making this really weird. I haven't set this up as a great example. But because I floated the image right, it's now going to be side-by-side with my paragraph, whereas before, when I don't float that image, it's just going to be stacked because that paragraph, remember, is going to take up the full width without regard for if there is actually more space. If I were to float left, for example, and I save, I see that same thing where now my images and my text is side by side, but now the image is on the left because I did float left. Cool. So I'm just going to delete all of what we did. It's just an example of something that you can do. but we're not actually going to have that in our final project. Cool. So I am going to scroll down in my CSS because we are actually going to add this float somewhere to this logo class. So it should say period logo. It should be around line 72-ish, depending on if have you added any more code. And here we are going to add that float left. I have a logo in our header and I have a logo in our footer, and I just want them to be as far left as possible. So before I save this, we can go here and we'll see that this is our current setup, right? If I go over here and I save it, what that does is it now puts my image of my logo in line with my list. It makes it look a little funny, but we're going to fix it. Before it had that kind of blank space. If I just quickly comment this out, it's now this logo. There's this blank space and my list is now here because that's just how it's structured in our HTML. But with that float, it makes it so that they can be side by side like that. Cool. So now we are back to our pretty normal setup right here. And we can see that it did apply down here as well because we have that class, that logo class applied down here too. So now let's start with this flex box, that left to right or top to bottom way that we can make this content size better and actually appear better on our code. So to work with this Flexbox framework, we have to create what is called a flex container. And so this is just using that div element in HTML, and then we'll target that div element and make it a flex container. So let's go and do that right now with our navigation section. So if I scroll all the way up to right here, we have our header. And so we have our header tag, which is encapsulating our entire thing up here. And then we also have the footer one down here. So we don't actually need to put it into a div because it's its own element up here. So I'm going to go to the very top and I am going to add my header and footer to be flex boxes. So I'm going to put header, comma, space, footer. And this just allows me to select both my header element and my footer element. I'm going to do my brackets, and I'm going to put display flex. So display flex allows our header and our footer to be flex containers. Now you'll notice it did make some changes to our layout already, right? So it's going to try to do some default stuff to kind of get us a part of the way there. And we're just going to continue to refine this, right? So that is how you set a container to be a flex container. And then there's a bunch of properties that you can set here as well that determines the behavior of the items that are contained within it. These like children items. So our logo, our list, and all of that. So the first one is that we're not going to use because we like the default is called flex direction. So by default, the flex direction is going to be from left to right. And we're going to keep that, but just so that you know in general that you can change it, you can change it to what is called row reverse, which just is basically the reverse of how it is in the HTML. So if I were to save that, I notice it pushes it all the way to the other side. My logo comes after my list. And that's just how you can flip the whole list on its side. If you want it to, instead of being left to right, being top to bottom, you can put it to column. And column is going to do something very similar to how we have it, where it's just up to down instead of left to right. And then there is also a column reverse if you want the same thing as that row reverse, but top to bottom. We like the default though, which is if anything ever gets messed up, the default is called just row, and that's just left to right. So let's just delete that. The next one that we also are not going to be using, but I just want you to be aware of, is called flex wrap. And this just basically determines what the behavior should be if elements need to be wrapped to a next line or not. So there is going to be wrap, which is just if you want it to be like if you have like 12 elements and like elements like 9 through 12 would be like across the screen, that they would wrap to a next line if there's no space for them. If you want it to be the reverse of that, where they're on the top of the line and all of your like 1 through 8 are on the bottom, that would be wrap reverse, which is also an option. And then the default, which we are good with, is no wrap. And this just basically means don't wrap our items if they take up too much space. The reason why we don't need to wrap them is we don't have enough items that is taking up too much space. Cool. So now the next one that we want to do, and we're actually going to be changing this, is called align items. So align hyphen items. And this one is going to position elements on what is called a secondary axis. So for every flexbox, there is going to be, let me save this real quick so we can see this. So for every flexbox, there's going to be a primary axis and a secondary axis. For rows, your primary is left to right and your secondary is top to bottom. If you change that to be column based, your primary axis is going to be top to bottom and your secondary one's going to be left to right. So we are going to align our items to the center. So this is going it based on our secondary column. And because our flexbox is a row, this is making them appear center vertically. So like this. So without this align items center, for example, I go back, it's just trying to put some default stuff right here, is putting them left to right, but this one's all the way at the top of this container. If I want these to be aligned center, where this is in the middle, I can just put align items center, and then now these are centered with each other. There is also other alignment options. You can do flex start, which would put all of the elements at the start of your flex container. There's also flex end, which is the end. So in this case, it would be that bottom. There is also stretch to get the elements to stretch to be their to be from the top to the bottom of the container. And then there is also baseline, which is a little tricky. But baseline there, if any of you are familiar with like InDesign or typography or stuff like that, there's like a baseline for all text. It's just basically that line where all of them sit. And this is how you can do that, where depending on different sizes of text and different fonts and stuff, you can have them all be aligned to their baseline. But we're good with center for now. So let's just do that. Cool. So now we are getting there, right? We got them side by side. But the problem that we have is that our list is still like a normal bulleted list without those bullets. It's just that 1's on top, 2, and then 3, and then 4. Doesn't look like a great nav menu because we want it to be left to right, like over here, for example, right? So the nice thing is you can put a flex box within a flex box. So we created one with our header and our footer. So this whole container right here is one flex box, and then there's one in the footer as well. In here, we're going to create another one within it that has our list right here. So if we go back to our code, we can see that our list is contained within this navigation section. So I'm also going to go down here, do nav, and then I'm going to display flex right here. So this is our flex box for our navigation menu. I also like these to be centered as well. So I'm going to put align items to center. And let me spell items correctly. And so I'm using the same exact properties, display flex, align item center. I'm just applying this to our navigation menu. So far, it hasn't done anything yet because our nav contains a unordered list with all of these elements. So let's do it one more time. So with our UL, put display to flex and align items to center. And when I save this, I can see that all of my things are right there. So basically, how we set it up was we had our header section. We created that header to be our flex container for our whole navigation bar at the top. Then we went through in the specific navigation menu. We don't technically need this nav element. It is just going back to that semantic HTML concept I brought up 2 weeks ago, where for those with low or no vision using a screen reader, it doesn't read certain things beautifully. And so this is just letting everyone know this is our navigation menu to understand our code as such. And then within here, we had our list. And so for each of those levels, header, nav, and our unordered list, we put display to flex and align items to center. So it makes it a Flexbox container, and that allows you to have it be responsive to like a screen size where, and I can show you real quick what we're going to be doing right now. But basically it allows it to be something that you can set to respond like this. Whereas before, like you couldn't apply these align items, the center. If you try to do that without putting display flex, it just wouldn't work. So you have to create it as a Flexbox container to kind of unlock these further styling. Yes, yeah. So I'll go through what I just did to show that as well. So if we go back to our thing, it's all the way over here, right? Now, last week we learned about some of that box model stuff. So the height, the width, our padding, our border, our margins. And there's a little trick that you can do to get this content to be all the way on the right side. And that is by setting under this nav, if you set the margin left, if you set it to auto, what this does is it tells browsers we want as much space on our margin left from its other content around it as possible. So setting nav to margin left auto, when we save that, it's going to push them all the way to our right side because there's a ton of space between our logo and then our menu. But as I resize my screen, that auto is going to change its value because there's not as much space now. Make sense? Cool. And all the stuff we've been doing has been applied to our footer as well, because we put that header footer up here to be displayed flex. It is also down here a nav section. It is also our unordered list. So all of the things we've been doing have applied to our footer as well. Cool. How are we feeling about what we just did? Cool. So now let's go a little bit further with some of our stuff. So we have our project buttons right here. So view, 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 etc. But they're placed in a really awkward position right now. And we want to change that. A really easy way to center elements within something in code. It's surprisingly hard, like just to do like centering it with code for some reason. But a way that I have found is super easy is to use this Flexbox that we've been playing around with and then aligning that to the center. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another CSS rule. And you'll notice that I put for each of these buttons, I put their class set to project button section. So I put each button within a div and then put that div to be this section. So if I were to go to project button section, target it with the period, which again is everything with the class set to this, I'm going to be setting this to be a display flex as well. So I put period project hyphen button hyphen section to target every div here that has this class equal to project button section. And we're going to create it as a Flexbox container. So now if I save that and I go back, nothing really happens. And the reason why nothing happens is because it is in a Flexbox container. We just have to now start using those properties that we've unlocked to further customize it. So we've been using align items to the center, which is going to be how you get them on that secondary axis. So in our row Flexboxes, that's our top to our bottom, there is a way that you can align these items from left to right on that primary axis. And how you do that is by using justify hyphen content. So justify hyphen content is very similar to our align items property, but instead of it going to be aligning them up to down or left to right, if you're using a column Flexbox, this is going to be aligning them left to right. So we can put center here as well. And if I save that, I can now see that all of my view buttons in project are now centered within their little card. I know that they're super big. Don't worry about that. We'll fix that with the grid concept that we're going to go through. So just to recap, you go to what the parent element is. So in our case of, let's say, these buttons that we just did, you go to what's called the parent element. So before I had them as H3, and then the button was right here, so not within a different div. But what happens is if I were to target this project card and apply some of those justify content, align items, it's going to go for everything within here. And so what I did was I put every button into its own div section. And then to create that Flexbox container, you target the parent, so this container, put display to flex. And then on that same one, you can put align items to change its usually vertical alignment. If you switch to be a column Flexbox, then it's going to be the horizontal. But in most cases, it's going to be your vertical. And then the justify content's going to do that that horizontal alignment there. It takes some practice. Cool. So there's a couple of other places that you can use it in our code here. For example, you could put it with our resume section. You could put these all as a flex box and put them in the center. Same with all of our contact button and this download button, that you can put those all in the center using that same technique. I'll leave that to you as a challenge. So we're gonna go to the next kind of thing, which is going to be our grid. So remember, with Flexbox, we're primarily working on one row or one column. For our grid, we're going to be working with multiple at the same time. This can be a little confusing, so I'm going to go a little slow on this one. I think it's really cool when you see it come into shape. And we're going to use this on our project section. So right now they look kind of bad, and that's just because I designed them in a grid and then I removed the grid. So apologies to your eyes for the past half an hour. But now we're going to put it back into that grid and we can see how it works a lot better. Okay, cool. So let's go back to our code. And I'm going to scroll in my HTML. So I know that I am at my grid that I want to do, my project section right here, just so I can see how it's all set up. And over here under what we've done is where I'm going to start writing my CSS code. So the thing with the grid is that you can determine how many columns you want, how many rows you want, and then also how much space there is going to be in between each of those. So all of my projects are within this div ID equals project section. All of my individual project cards or like groupings are in this section. So I want to make this div that contains them all. This is going to be my grid container. So just like we made a Flexbox container, we're going to make a grid container, and you do it the same exact way. So let's target this div using our hashtag or pound symbol, because we have an ID right here, and then we type in projects hyphen section, because that's what I put up here. So ID equals project section, and that's how we target it right here. We do the same exact thing with the Flexbox container, but instead of writing flex, we write grid. So display, and then we put grid. So if I save this and I go back here, you'll notice it again still doesn't do anything. This does exactly like the Flex container does, where it doesn't really do anything until you further define it with some other properties. The first one that we're going to do is define some columns. So you're going to put as a property grid template columns. And how you put in columns here is you can just put their sizes like 50 pixels, 50 pixels, 50 pixels, 50 pixels, let's say. What this is going to do is it's going to create 4 columns that are all 50 pixels wide. It's going to look bad, but you can see that I have 4 columns now, and they're each 50 pixels wide. And it's trying to fit my content in there. It can't because it's a little weird. So that is how you can add your columns to here. Now, as you can imagine, we've talked about last week that pixels are an absolute unit. So if I say 50 pixels, even though this screen can fit so much more, it is only going to display at 50 pixels, no matter what the screen size is, which is not what we're trying to do today. We're trying to make this more responsive. So Another unit that we can do that we have not played around with yet is the fractional unit. So that's going to be FR. So if I put 1FR, 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 this is now going to create 4 columns that are all equal to each other because we're setting them all to this one fraction of the thing. So this thing, we have 4 fractions, and I can see that now it does fill up the entire thing. And if I resize, it's going to be resizing with my screen because it's looking at, hey, I have this size for my grid, and each of these are going to take up essentially 1/4. If I wanted, let's say, to have a column that was bigger than the other ones with this, I can change one of them to 2. So I'm going to change the second one to 2. So I'm going to have 1FR, 2FR, 1FR, 1FR. And what this is going to have is my first column, my third one, and my fourth one are going to be the same size. But my second one is going to be 2 times as big, which I can see right here. And this still, because we're using that fractional unit, it still resizes with our screen. So now what I want to do is I want us to have 12 columns. Now, the reason why I want 12 columns is because it is divisible by a bunch of other numbers, right? So if I were to have 3 columns, the only uniform design I can have is one thing in each column. Otherwise, I would need to have something like this, where one thing takes up 1 column, another thing takes up like 2. 12, you can divide it by 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12. Right? So you can have 12 uniform things. You can have something, 3 things that are all 4 columns as wide. So I want 12 just because it's divisible by a bunch. But as you can imagine, typing in 1FR, 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 and keep on doing it 12 times can get annoying. So there is a quick and easy way to do it, and that is using this repeat function. So if you put repeat, and then in these parentheses, if you put 12, comma, 1FR, and then you go out and remember to put that semicolon in there. This is saying, hey, repeat 12 columns at this size. So if I do that and I go back, there is going to be 12, but I only have 6 things in here, right? Don't worry, we'll make them spread over multiple columns in a little bit. We can do the same thing with our rows, which is going to be grid template rows. And you can use the same things, those pixel sizes, 1FR, 2FR for fractional. You can use the repeat thing to create multiple things at once. In this case, I know that I only want to have 2 rows. I want 3 projects at the top and 3 projects on the bottom. And so I'm just going to put 1FR, 1FR, and this creates my 2 columns, or my 2 rows, sorry. My 2 rows that are equal to each other. And again, if I go over here, you'll notice it just added a bunch of white space right now. And that is because we haven't told the code how many rows and columns we want each of these elements to take up. Which once we do that, it's going to look a lot better. And the last thing that I'm going to do right here is going to be the gap in between our stuff. Because right now that they're really put in there tight, doesn't look the greatest. I want some white space. So I'm going to put gap and then put 25 pixels. And this just creates a 25 pixel gap between my columns and my rows. And just so it looks a little bit better, there's a little bit more white space in there. Okay, how do we feel about setting up our grid? Cool. So now the next thing is we are going to play around with how do we get these elements to take up more than one cell at a time. So I'm going to show you a neat little trick, again, using Chrome DevTools. So if you open up your site in Google Chrome, you control, click inspect. You're going to be here in Chrome DevTools. So you'll notice now that we put it displayed a grid, that there's now this grid toggle right here, right by our div ID equals project section. And when I click on it, I can now see where my content is. I can see where my columns are and my rows. I can see the gap. And so I can see that I do have 12 columns here. I do have my 2 rows, and each thing is trying to take up one kind of cell, right? So we're going to want these to stretch to more than 1 because I want 3 on the top and 3 on the bottom. So if you look here, you'll notice that the number 1 starts before the first column, and that the very end is going to be 13, which is 1 more than the amount of columns that we set. And that's going to be important for what we're about to do. So now let's go back to our code, and we want this first image or this first project to be at least 4 columns wide, right? Because we have 12 columns, and I want 3 of these projects to be on the top. So I need each of them to span 4 columns so that it fills that full thing with just 3 of these projects. So how I do that is I want to go to my project 1 card, which is this ID equals project 1 card. So again, to target that with our CSS, we put our pound symbol, project -1 -card. And in here, I can say grid column start. And then now, as its value, I can place the column that I want this item to start at. So I'm going to put 1. And then I can also set my grid column end. So here's a little bit of a trick and why it's helpful to pull this open in Chrome DevTools. So your grid column end needs to be the number after the column that you want it to end at, because 1 is right here at the very start. So we're saying start here at column 1, and I want it to go to 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. So I need my grid column end to be 5 to make sure it goes all the way through the end of that column. So if I put 5 here, and let's say I save this, and I go back, I can see now, even though it looks a little funny because everything else hasn't been set yet, I can see that it takes up columns 1 through 4 because I set the start to 1 and the end to 5. So now we need to do the same thing for our second project, but for the next 4 columns. So column 5, 6, 7, and 8. So my grid column start is going to be 5, and my grid column end is going to be 9 right here. So let's go and do that right now. So project 2 card, my grid column start is going to be 5, and my grid column end is going to be 9. So it's the same kind of structure right here. So it's just changing these values to the project 2 card, and then from column 5 through column 8 to the end at 9. And when I go back to view how this affected my stuff, I can see that these are now coming more into shape. And I have one last one I need to do to get all 3 to be on this top row. And that's setting my project 3 card. As you can imagine, our start is going to be at 9. Our end is going to be at 13. But there's a little bit of a trick here because you can also use negative numbers. Negative is basically the same thing, but backwards. So 13 is -1, 12 is -2, 11 is -3. Really, the way that you're going to be using this the most is just to find what is that last one. So if I don't want to mess up and forget that I have to use 13, I can use -1 as my column end instead. So let's do that. Let's go back to our code, pound, project 3, card, grid, column, start is going to be 9, and our grid column end, you can either put 13, which is the end of column 12, or -1 to just say at the end of the last column. They do the same thing. So if I save that with my project 3 card, grid column start to 9, and grid column end to -1, I can now see that they fill up my columns evenly. It looks a little like they don't, but that's because we haven't set these ones yet. Cool. So let's go and set these ones so that they're looking better. So this is project 4, 5, and 6, and you just need to use the same values as 1 to 4, 2 to 5, and 3 to 6 to get them in that same position. So we're going to do that real quick. Project 4 card. I'm a big fan of copy and paste when you can. So I'm just going to copy this code from project 1. For project 5, I'm going to copy the code from project 2. And for project 6, I'm going to copy the code from project 3. When I save that and I go back to view, I can now see that I have this nice grid layout right here. Something that we did not need to do because these projects are cool to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 4, 5, 6, because in that order is set the rows, but you can also set the rows and where each item is taking up. So let's say for some reason I wanted project 1 to take up both row 1 and row 2. I can say project 1 up here, grid row start is going to be 1. And if I want to grid row end to -1 to be at the very end, I will see that I get that in that as well. It's a little funky because of how much content that I have. But you can also use those same things, but instead of grid column start, you can do grid row start and grid row end to say which rows that they're taking up. But we don't need to do that in this case. So as you can imagine, writing grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, grid row end, when you're creating some more dynamic stuff, it gets to be a lot, right? It's 4 lines if you have to do all 4 of them of code. There is a shorthand. So remember last week we had like the border radius, the border color, the border style, and we can put them all into just border. You can do a similar thing with these right here, where you can put grid area. So grid area is the shorthand for defining your row start, your column start, your row end, and then your column end all in one property. So here I can put grid area, and it starts off with our row start. So I want it to start at row 1, and then I put a space and a forward/, and I'm going to put another space, and then I'll put where I want this to column start. So that's going to be 1 as well. Then I can do the next value, and this is my row end. So where do I want this content to end at the row? So I can put 2, and then I can do another number to be where my column end is. So I can put 5. Now this should hopefully not change too much, or if anything. So I saved and I went back here and I can see that it's still in the same place, but I just wrote it quicker. So grid area, you start with your row start and then your column start and then your row end and then your column end. So a grid, you have more control over both the horizontal and the vertical. So in this case, for example, we were able to create columns and rows and place stuff like that. A flexbox is really only good for putting things in one line. So like left to right or top to bottom, where a grid allows us to do both. So now I'm going to show the last bit of this responsive web design that we haven't covered, and that's this media queries. So this is how do we write some code that we can have change based on which device someone is using. So I'm going to go back to my preview here. Right here in Chrome DevTools, I can click on this device toolbar. And what this allows me to do is to kind of simulate how this looks under different devices. That's this button right here. And so I can see my device dimensions right here. So maybe I'm going to take a look at this as our example. So it looks really good. And then as we make our device smaller and smaller and smaller, I can see that it looks still pretty good, but maybe around like the 1050, I'm kind of like, okay, these are a little crunched, right? Maybe I want them, instead of it only having 3 on each row, maybe I want to change it to be 2. So have just a 1 from here, from 1 to the 7, and then 1 from that 7 to that end at the 13, so that I can see those pictures maybe a little bit better. I can see that text some better. That is where your media query is going to come in. So we are going to go above our project sections right here. So mine's around line 21. So just before you put where something is a grid, and I'm going to put at media. So if you put at media, this is basically telling your code, hey, we're going to look at this media query. We're going to take a look at something that relates to that user's device. I'm going to put a space. and put a parenthesis. And in between my parentheses, I'm going to do min hyphen width. What this is, it stands for minimum width. So last week we went through some height and width properties for just determining the size of content. There also is a minimum width and a maximum width and a minimum height and a maximum height property. And this is basically how we can say, hey, until like 1050, so 1050 I think is the minimum that I want this layout. I can say that right here. So look at the screen, minimum width at 1050. I'm going to put 1051, let's say. And then I'm going to put a space and put that our curly brackets. I'm going to just cut this last one, this closing one, and place this at the end of my grid section. So I put at media parenthesis min width 1051 pixels. And then I have my all of the grid. I don't want the dictionary. I have all of the grid code contained within those curly brackets. And I just highlighted everything and pressed tab once to make it all indented. So this is now telling this code, hey, if this screen size is larger than 1050, use our grid structure, larger than 1051. But you'll notice as I get down and I go past that 1050, it's going to change back to our previous layout. So now what we can do is we can determine a grid to be for the next section of content. So I'm going to say at the very bottom here, after all of our stuff, I'm going to put another media query. So at media, make sure you spell it right. And then you can also specify two different things at the same time. So I'm going to put in parentheses, I'm going to put my min width to 751 pixels. Outside of my parentheses, I'm going to put a space and then the word and then space again. And then this time I'm going to use my max width and set that to 1050 pixels. So what this now is doing is this is allowing us to define some code that only works when the user screen is in between these two width sizes. And I'm going to put my curly brackets again. And in here, I'm going to create another grid. There's a different grid layout than we want before. So I'm going to put my hyphen projects section. I'm going to do the same stuff of display to grid. This time for my grid template columns, instead of doing 12, I'm just going to make it really easy. I want to have two that are the same size. So my repeat function, 2 columns at 1 fraction. This time I want some more rows, so I'm going to do the same thing, my repeat, but I'm going to do 3, and I'm also going to set my gap here to also be 25 pixels. So we're just creating another grid that uses 2 columns instead of 12 and 3 rows instead of 2. Now we can do the same thing with our grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, grid row end, or a grid area. Let's get practice with that shorthand. So I'm going to put my project 1 card. I'm going to set that grid area to 1 for my row start, 1 for my column start, 2 for my row end, and 2 for my column end. I'm going to now work on my project 2 card. And this grid area, the numbers are going to be 1, 2, 2, -1. Because remember, we want this to just be at the very right side of our column. My project 3 card, my grid area, the numbers are 2, 1, 3, 2. We got our project 4 card, 2, 2, 3, -1. I'm just going to fly through here. My project 5 has 3, 1, 4, and 2. And I have my project 6 at 3, 2, 4, and -1. I'm going to quickly just show what that impact was, and I'll come back so you can finish copying if you would like. So now, if my grid is going to be above that 1051 pixel width, it's going to have that initial grid that we did, where it's the 12 columns with our 2 rows. But then for any screen that is below that 1051, it now has that new grid that we just did. I did put a min width of 751. So now if I go all the way down to below that, I can see that they now just kind of get placed all like this. You can change this again, put your maximum width to 750 and then create another grid or do a flex box or some other type of layout that applies to all of this. But this is the way that you can use those media queries and change the layout of something based on a user's screen size. That is the bulk of what we wanted to accomplish today. If you're interested, I do have a couple of other things that I can show you that are, I think, pretty cool. So the first thing that I want to show you is somewhat of a like ease of life kind of thing, ease of our coding. So if we go through like our CSS code right here, you'll notice that we have some colors in the background colors, and we're repeating the same hex code multiple times, right? So I have this blue color right here, I have this blue one right here, and I have to keep copy and pasting and moving around. And if I decided, hey, I've gotten sick of that blue color, I want to change to a different blue, I have to go and find every instance of it and change it. What CSS allows you to do is actually define your colors at the very beginning. So I'm going to put in square brackets at the very top. I'm going to do data hyphen theme equals light. And this is because I was creating like a light and dark theme for colors. And then I'm going to put my curly brackets. So this is allowing us to create what are called variables. And these are just a container for some sort of data. So I can put a 2 hyphen mark right here, and then I can put text, for example, and then input the text value that I want. So this could be, oh, that's the wrong one. I'm going to do this one right here. And let me change that. There we go. So this is essentially what I'm saying is I'm saying, hey, create this theme that is going to have a bunch of these elements in here and create this variable called text and set it equal to this color. So by default, it's not going to do anything, but I can use this variable later on to determine what color text to use. So I'm just going to quickly do this right here. So for my paragraph, my heading 1, and for my links, I am going to set their color to this variable. I don't set it to that specific color. So to do that, I would put VAR parenthesis and then that name. So in this case, it is 2 hyphens and text. Okay. And I can see just already with Visual Studio Code is telling me that there's a color value assigned to it. So now if I save this, it's not going to change anything by default, right? Because this is the color I was using for my text before. So I'm going to go out of here and go up to here. It's the same text color, let's say. But let's say I'm working with a client, let's say, and they decide to change the color, or let's say I'm just working by myself and I decide to hate this color and I want to change it to something else. I can do that instead of having to go into each time that I put this color code in. I could just go up here, change the value. Let's say I do like this. And now this is going to be the new value that's passed to every instance of this variable. So if I save this and I go back, I can notice that I didn't have to go into every CSS code rule and change that color for my text. I could just do it in one location if I set it up using these variables.
Setting or type those color by just use this one.
So if you want to just do like one, like for example, like the page title, you can just go like this and then put whatever color you want. This essentially allows you to like do some sort of like data management with multiple colors. So in this case, like I have like this green color 2CDD79. I could create something that's like green and then 2DCC79, I think it was. And then now instead of typing that in multiple times in different locations, I can just put it like this. And then the next time I have to use it, again, I don't have to put that same color code. I can put that same variable is green. And then now if I change the green value up here, it'll change for anything that I put that variable green to. So a little bit about variables. One application of this that is pretty cool to see, which don't follow along with me on this one because it's a little bit hard. It includes JavaScript, which we're not including. But so I have my data theme as light and I have this green color and I've implemented that green color in a couple of different locations. So like down here, my view button hover and my button hover right here. So what I can do is I can now set a different data theme. I'm going to put this one to dark and I'm going to set the green value to a different one right here. Right? So basically, I'm having this contextual green color. So it's going to be this one if the data theme is set to light, and then this one if the data theme is set to dark. And I can see that I have my data theme set to light right here on my HTML tag. So what I'm going to do is I have this button already that I want to allow me to change between a light and a dark theme, right? So right now I'm just seeing that light theme hover green because that's what I've set for when my data theme equals light. So what I am going to do is I'm going to add a new file. It's going to be called script.js. This is a little preview of things that you can do with JavaScript. I'm going to create the JavaScript variable. And again, this is a little difficult. I'm going to select the element that I want to apply some stuff to. So this is going to be my dark theme button right here. I'm going to then to that theme button, I'm going to add what's called an event listener. And this is just basically like, hey, look for something that the user's doing. So I'm going to say click is going to be what my event is. And then I'm going to say run this theme toggle function. Now, in order to do it, I need to create my theme toggle function. Don't worry, this took lots of practice to get correct. I'm going to track what my current theme is by looking at the value in my attribute. And then after I see what that value is, I can say, hey, if my current theme is equal to light, so that's what I've set it to right now, run this code. And for this case, it is going to be change that attribute to of data theme. Let's change it to dark. And then I can do something else, for example, of like, like changing the button and stuff like that. But let's just show you what this looks like. So I'm going to link to there. So now when I go back to my thing, nothing's changed because I'm still in my light theme. That data theme attribute is still set to light. It's still this great. However, if I click on my button, my data theme attribute is now going to be dark instead of light. And I can see that by inspecting in Chrome DevTools. I go here, my data theme has switched to dark, that attribute. Because I put data theme light and dark, different colors for green, it's now going to be a slightly different green. It's a very similar green, but it's a different green than it was at my other one.
Seeing like background, like turning white to black and
There's some ways that like you can code it where it looks at the user's like system preferences of like whether it's going to show up as dark or light by default. But in order to choose which specific colors show up, you do have to put each of those in. So that was very brief look at what you can do with JavaScript kind of thing. But let's go back to CSS. Let's go back to some stuff that you already know and do some fun stuff. So what I want us to do here is I want us to, when we hover over this contact button, let's say, I want it to change colors. And you can do that all with CSS. So let's go back to our CSS code. And so what we are going to do is start by using what is called the filter property. And the filter, you can apply a bunch of different kind of effects to an element. A lot of them will be images. So if you're used to something like Photoshop, you might know things like blur and contrast and saturation, a drop shadow, for example. All of those are examples of these filters. There's also one that's pretty cool called a hue rotate, which allows you to change the color on a color wheel based on like the angle of how far away it is from that. It's a little hard to specifically determine what color you're ending up on unless if you have a color wheel and a protractor out or something. But if we just wanted to kind of loop in a kind of fun animation, I think that we can do that. So pretty well. So let's go and find where our button hover is right here. So right now we have our variable set to our green. So it should be our button, our colon, and our hover. This is where we're going to be editing right now. So we're just going to be doing it where you hover over a button and it plays this cool little animation. So the first thing that we want to set after this is going to be that filter. So we're going to put filter and we're going to put hue hyphen rotate. And then in parentheses, I'm going to put 0 degrees, right? And make sure to have your semicolons at the end of every line. So basically this is not going to do anything, right? I'm saying change my hue by 0. So doesn't do anything, but as we start to animate it, we can allow it to change what this value is going to be. We're going to add also, we're going to put animation hyphen name. And this, just put whatever name you want. You're going to name an animation. I'm going to call it button color change, but you can put it to whatever you want it to be. And the next thing that we're going to do here is we are going to put animation duration. So how long do we want this animation to play for? So I'm going to put 10s for 10 seconds. So if I were to save this and I go back and I hover over, nothing's going to happen because we haven't actually specified what our animation is going to be. So before your button hover, let's define what this animation is going to do. And very similar to how we did with media queries not too long ago, we start this with the @ symbol, and then we put in what's called keyframes. For those of you who are not familiar with animation, keyframes are basically how you can specify what the property of a specific element is at a given time, right? So I can put a keyframe at 1 second to have it be green, and then a keyframe at 2 seconds to be blue. And then when it goes from 1 second to 2, it would go from green to blue. And this is how we define our animation. Put the name that you put in before. So I did button color change, but if you did something else, place that. And then I opened up my curly brackets here. And this is where we can determine what our keyframes are. And so we do this with a percentage. So I'm going to start at 0%, and then I'm going to press the tab button. So this is basically saying at 0% of our duration, so at 0 of 10 seconds, we want the filter to be set to hue, rotate 0 degrees. Which is very similar to what we had done here. We're just doing it again. And make sure that this is all encapsulated in its own curly brackets and that you are closing it with that semicolon. But now I'm going to click return. A fourth of the way through, so 25%, I'm going to then tab again. I want to change this value. So I'm going to say filter, hue rotate, and I want it to be around 90 degrees, so 90 DEG. And remember the semicolon around the color wheel. And then we're going to add at 50% the filter, hue rotate, going to be set to another value of 180 degrees, 75% of our animation. We want it to be 75% of the way through that color wheel. And then at 100%, so the closing of our animation, we want it to be at here, and I did the wrong thing. Cool. So now what I've basically done is created this animation that at 0% of completion, it's going to be at the exact same color that we specified. A fourth of the way through, it is going to be 90 degrees down the color wheel. Halfway through the animation, we're halfway around the color wheel. 75%, we're 75% around the color wheel. And then 100% at the end of the animation, we're back to that color that we had before. So if I save this and we go back and I hover over contact, you'll see that this color is changing. That's a neat little trick to have something that's really fun. You can apply animations to a lot of different properties, not just this filter button. Now, you might notice as you hover over it for the total of the 10 seconds, at the very end, it just stays at that original color because that's what we specified. If you want it to play for longer, you can put the animation iteration count to infinite. So animation iteration count, you can put a value like 1, 2, 3, 4, for example, to just have like how many times that animation should play. But if you put infinite on there, this animation is going to play for as long as it can. And in this case, we only applied it to when we're hovering over a button. So as long as we are hovering over that like contact button or the view button or anything, that animation is going to play and that color is going to keep changing and stuff like that. Well, I have one last thing that I'll show you that's pretty nifty. So far with our colors, we have done pretty static colors, right? So we've been specifying what shade of blue, what shade of green, what shade of black, etc. You can do gradients in CSS as well. So we're going to do this for our background of our entire website. So this is going to be that body. So I'm going to go up here and do body to target my whole entire background. And it's a little funky with gradients. For some reason, the one that you need to use is not background color, it's background image. And then you can specify the type of gradient that you want it to be. So there's linear, so from one side to the other. There's also radial and conic. So one of those will be like going from the center outwards, and then the other one's kind of like this weird like line from the top to the middle and then goes like around like a wheel. We're just going to do a linear gradient. So you just type in linear gradient. And then in parentheses, the first thing that you do is you specify the direction that you want it to go. So I want mine to be kind of this cool diagonal from like top left to bottom right. So to do that, you just put to bottom right. Then you put a comma, and then now you can put as many different what are called color steps as you want. So this could be the number of colors that you want to show up. So just to show you how this looks like, I'm going to start off with, we'll just start with red, and then orange, and then yellow, and then green. This is going to look horrendous, I warn you. Blue and purple. And at the very end, make sure you do that semicolon. So now if I save and I go back, I get this gradient on my background that goes from my top left to my bottom right, and with every color along the way that's blended as well. So if let's say I was like, you know what, this yellow, I don't want the yellow, and I'm just going to get rid of that, and I don't have to specify another one that just changes how many colors there are. And I go back, I can now see that there's no yellow in between, even though it does look like it is because it's trying to blend some of this orange and that green together in our colors. Obviously, you don't have to use these specific color keywords. You can use those hex codes, the RGBs, whatever kind of color key that you want to do as well. Okay, so I think that is enough CSS to drive you crazy, probably. But hopefully you feel a little bit more confident in how you can style your own website.